This is my favorite question because the answer is so simple. Go to the river and be present with her and let the river soak into you. And, for photographers, you'll make some pictures and that's important. But the really important part is for each of us to develop our own relationship to rivers in the American West. And photographers especially have the ability to shift people's perceptions because we're the witnesses. Those other folks aren't witnessing.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 397 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. Today's guest is Dave Showalter, a photographer who has been recommended by countless previous guests, so you can imagine that I was quite happy to finally get him to join me for a conversation. Dave works throughout the ecosystems of the Intermountain West and has published 3 incredible books. He is a senior fellow in the International League of Conservation Photographers and a longtime contributor and partner of Platte Basin Time-Lapse. I'm so excited to have him here. Before we dive in, I am thrilled to share that this week's podcast is brought to you by Elements Magazine. If you're passionate about photography, it is an absolute must-read. Elements is a top-tier publication that showcases jaw-dropping photography from some of the most talented photographers out there, many of whom you've heard right here on this podcast. Legends like Theo Bosboom, Michelle Sons, Hans Strand, Simon Baxter, Rachel Talabart, Paul Wakefield, and so many others. Every issue is carefully crafted and contains stunning content handpicked for landscape photography lovers like us. The latest issue is all about autumn photography, complete with behind-the-scenes stories on how each photograph was captured. It's the perfect blend of inspiration and education. I can't recommend subscribing enough. Head on over to elementsphotomag.com or find a link in the show notes. Trust me, you'll love it. Okay, let's get to this week's conversation with Dave Showalter. All right, Dave Showalter, we finally did it.
How about that?
We were laughing before we hit record because I was looking back through this spreadsheet that I keep for people that get recommended for the podcast, and I think your name gets brought up probably at least 2 or 3 times a year for the last 7 years. So now we're here.
I'm happy to be here. And conversely, quite a few people have said, have you talked to Matt yet? So I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Awesome, man. Well, I've been a huge fan of what you're doing and the photography you've created for a long time as well. And so I'm super excited to see where this conversation takes us. With that being said, Dave, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about who Dave Showalter is?
Sure. I'm based in Arvada, Colorado. I'm a full-time conservation photographer, and I wasn't always. I had a corporate career before this, and when I went full-time in 2008, I made the decision that I would be focused on Western conservation. So I don't run all over the world, I run all over the West, and I work in all the ecosystems of the West. I also, beyond my own work, I'm an International League of Conservation Photographers Senior Fellow, and I also work with Platte Basin Time-Lapse and Michael Forsberg out of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I teach for summit workshops, just try to do everything I can to tell good stories about Western conservation.
That sounds so simple. Even though we know it's not, right? Like what you just said is like that could be someone could spend literally 40 years doing what you're doing and just barely scratch the surface, right?
Yeah, that's any of us though. I guess it's just a matter of how much can you expand your thinking about some of these ideas and how do you flush out the right ideas that become stories or threads of stories. And that's where it gets really interesting.
Right. So how did you originally get into photography?
Yeah, so I was a sales rep, and at the time dating Marla, who would become my wife, and we started exploring, adventuring, backpacking in Colorado and Wyoming together. We made a trip to the Grand Canyon, and I took a point-and-shoot camera. I thought I made a bunch of great pictures. I did not. They were horrific, and I went and bought a real camera right after that. And that changed the way I see. And I just pretty much learned by doing. I did take 2 workshops along the way, really paid a lot of attention to what other successful photographers were doing. And in time, I was exposed to the ILCP and storytelling, and that was a fork in the road. But, it was just a lot of really exploring and initially following my bliss. But I thought the work should be about something. I took this workshop in Montana that was about storytelling. And there, in the early 2000s, I developed an idea for a prairie book that was focused on the eastern half of Colorado, and that became a book, Prairie Thunder, published by our friend Todd Caudle, who is Skyline Press here in Colorado. That gave me a sort of a foundation to launch other ideas from, to realize that this stuff it's not out of reach, it's possible.
Love it. So, in your mind, what does it actually mean to be a conservation photographer? Because I look at your work and I look at the work of other people I admire who are doing this type of stuff, and it's this interesting mixture, right, of kind of landscapes and nature, but then you've also got the human element. You're telling stories. So kind of give us an idea of what you think conservation photography is about.
I think the heart of it is telling stories so people will care. But I sort of couch that in thinking deeply about the creative process, which isn't so much about considering outcomes while you're creating, but it's just like it's making the best thing you can and putting it out there. But along the way in these stories, you speak about the human element and all of these different aspects. It's really all the same thing, and we need to tell stories through people, because that gives our readers, our viewers, a handle to enter that space and to consider what they may be able to do or how they may be able to contribute in some meaningful way. So I think once upon a time, Michael Forsberg told me, we were working together on my Sage story, and he was mentoring me, and he said, at some point, Dave, the story's going to take the lead and you're just going to hold on. And that's kind of the deal. Once you find the threads for these stories and they've been identified and you're digging deeper in those things, the story decides what pictures you make. The story decides, what the chapters of a book might look like, what the layout is. So it's really tuning into the heart of what you want to get to with these stories, and finding a way to make them relatable to other folks, to draw them into the fold. As
you were speaking, it occurred to me that approach to storytelling is very similar to kind of what's working for me when I do photography trips. Instead of going out with a very specific purpose, I am just putting myself into a very photogenic place and then paying attention and listening and responding and reacting and letting the subject lead me down the path that it needs to take me. And I love that you prefaced it that way.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm thinking of your Colorado Trail trip. And how many days were you out for that?
Oh, yeah, 35 days.
And it must have been an astounding amount of planning of where you wanted to be along the way, at least high points. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, man, of course. So it's interesting you said that, because I did do a ton of planning, but my anxiety was mostly around logistics in terms of like, how much food do I need to bring, and where am I going to get the food, and is it going to be enough food, and where am I going to get water on specific areas of the trail where it's dry, or things like that. And then in terms of like the photography was kind of secondary for me, but I knew that there were very specific areas that I wanted to make sure I spent more time in. So I basically kind of pre-planned to hike less miles in the parts of the trail that I knew I wanted to photograph more. And then I would actually built in several extra days so that I could do photography and mountain climbing excursions that were close to the trail. It slowed me down. I probably could have finished the trail in 20 days if I didn't do that. But it was important for me to maximize the photography potential in terms of photographing specific areas that I was mostly interested in. So as you could probably guess, that amounted to spending more times around bigger mountains that I had history with, or specific areas. Like, for example, there's this particular scene that I have been wanting to visit for a very long time that you had mentioned Todd Caudle's name. There's a scene that he has a photograph of. It's near the Three Apostles, and I've climbed the Three Apostles and I've climbed Mount Huron before, but I'd never photographed that particular vantage point. And it's like higher up looking east, and you're at these amazing ponds that are up there above tree line. And I was like, I got to get there. And there's no trail up there. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to go hike up there, bushwhack up there and photograph it. And of course it worked out perfect. And so that was like an example. And then of course I spent way extra time in different areas in the San Juans that I wanted to photograph as well. So yeah, that was a really exciting part of the adventure for sure.
Well, you told some good stories from that journey too. And, just to pick up on what is a conservation photographer thought, the other part of that is any of us can add more meaning, more depth, more story to our pictures, like just simply captioning them well on Instagram. And when I meet with young people, new folks who want to, people call and say, hey, I'd like to have a cup of coffee and talk about what is this conservation photography or the International League of Conservation Photographers. First thing I ask them is, what do you have to say? And I just sit there and listen. And I think we all have something important to say. And so I would just encourage folks to dig in a little bit and add some more texture and grit and authentic stories that come from the heart. The world needs those.
Yeah, to your point, I love following photographers on Instagram that take the extra time to tell the story about what the image was about, what it means to them, why they captured it. And I don't care what anyone says. Yes, a picture paints 1,000 words, but also getting the words from the photographer, for me, it adds just so much more depth and helps me connect much more deeply to a specific image. So spot on.
That's great.
Yeah.
Think about like a cold morning in a sage-grouse blind, and you're waiting and you start to just see the silhouettes of the birds, and just how thrilling all of that is. And I would want to say more than sage-grouse on a lek in Wyoming about that,
Right. It doesn't really pull at the heartstrings.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And no, it's a really good point. I think even if you're not interested in conservation photography, I think there's value in providing more connective tissue between you as the photographer and the subject for the viewer, because I think it just helps to, paint the story, but then also someone gets a glimpse into who you are as a person, which is, for me, that's what artistic expression is all about. So
yeah,
love
well
that.
Said.
Yeah. Well, Dave, I feel like a lot of photographers overthink our potential roles as storytellers. How can we take people on a journey to see ourselves as part of nature and the community of living things? And what practical impacts can this have on the places that we love?
Well, tell better stories. So I hate to beat the drum over and over and over, but you're a person moving through the landscape. I think about you on the Colorado Trail and just how incredibly inspiring that is. And I want to tap into, some of what that experience is like for you and what you're seeing and hearing and feeling and eating, and how far you're traveling and just how all of that is going. And we are the connective tissue too. And I think that gets forgotten. Our art, we are part of our art. There is no separation. And just as there's no separation between us and the wilderness or our subjects. So I think all of us owe it to ourselves to dig a little deeper and, find some threads to share with folks. The other thing is, the people I like to follow are people that sort of their work is a continuum where you feel like you're on this journey with them for years, maybe, as they're working up to creating something, whatever that is, or digging deep into place or a creature. And I think there's just tremendous inherent value in all of that. And the authentic piece matters a lot, because we can't tell a story without, to some degree, putting ourselves into it. And it doesn't have to be like, hey, look at me, I've done this great exploit, I've I've climbed the biggest peak. It doesn't have to be like that. But we just have so much to offer through our witnessing, through our experiences. And that's what we are out there, is we're the witnesses. And that's what draws people to these stories, is maybe they haven't had that experience, or maybe they've had another experience. Maybe they took that raft trip down the Colorado River, so they know some of those places, and their experience was different, but it's totally relatable. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So I think all of that matters.
Yeah, and your point, when I look at a lot of my favorite photographers' images, I feel like I'm right there with them, like standing next to them as they capture the image, and especially if it's someone, like you said, someone I've been following for a long time, and I've seen the evolution in their style, or the evolution in the things that they're drawn to. And I love that about this medium, and that you can kind of go on this journey with other people and experience things without actually having gone to those places yourself.
There you go. My Living River book is simply my journey over parts of 6 years, and what that looks like. And then there's some stuff in there too from previous experiences that kind of led me to that project. But I did feel a strong responsibility to take people along with me, to take them to the river. And I think we are uniquely qualified to do that, no matter what the heck we're working on.
Man, what a perfect segue. So I got the book right here. It's amazing. It's really, really awesome. Thank you for sending me a copy of it. I have lots to say about the book, but I want to get you to talk about it a little bit first. So for your latest book, Living River, you chose to tell a hopeful story of the Colorado River. How did you come to the story, and what gives you hope? Because I feel like all we hear is negative information about what's happening with the Colorado River and the way that water is allocated and things like that. So tell us more.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the kind words about the book. I came to it, I wasn't looking for a story. I had just finished my Sage Spirit book. I was in D.C. at the Audubon National Meeting giving a presentation. I was invited to a breakout session where they showed the Western Rivers Action Network. And their pictures were terrible, and I thought, well, I have something to contribute here. And shortly after that, I heard an expert who should have known better say that the Colorado River is dying. And I thought, I have something to say about that. And that's not my experience. And I've been backpacking headwaters and throughout Colorado and in this watershed for a long time at that point, 20 years or something, more than that. And but I didn't know much about the inner workings of the Colorado River. So I just started. And I started on my own. I leaned on Mike Forsberg and my Platte Basin time-lapse friends for ideas, or to just bounce ideas off of. And it took me about 2 years to see enough of the watershed to start to sort out what I wanted, the major threads to be, which would become chapters, where I wanted to focus my work. Because you can't work on a whole 1,450-mile long river plus tributaries that add up to thousands of miles. But you can pick your spots that are emblematic of other places and tie it in to the big river that way. So that's how I approached it. But the hopeful piece was, there's so many stories of a dying river, and you kind of have to separate it in your mind from the plumbing system downstream of the Grand Canyon. I call it the plumbing system, where it starts to become dams and reservoirs and canals and lots of very intensive industrial agriculture as you go downstream from the Grand Canyon or from Lake Mead. And above that, so we live in the headwaters, basically. I'm up here in Arvada, an hour and a half away from the very headwaters of the Colorado River on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. And those waters, as imperiled as the river is, those waters still have to flow. The snow melts, sends water downstream. Yeah, it gets impounded, gets reused, tumbles all the way down to the Colorado River Delta in Mexico. But that water has to flow to those downstream users, to our downstream neighbors. And that's where it gets really interesting. Now you have places that are just extraordinary, where you have flowing water, you have cottonwood, you have willow, so you have birds and moose and deer and all the animals that are supposed to be there. I don't shy away from the challenges and the imperiled nature of the river. and I know a number of the folks that are in on the current renegotiations, and so I have some insight into that. But so that's all important for context, but it's also important to say, you know what? We have places that are worth saving. We have places that are just incredible. And there's people working in these spaces for decades, for a whole career, building community to save their part of the Gila River or the San Pedro River or the Fraser River headwaters near Winter Park. And those are the areas I chose to work in. I'm glad, I thought it needed to be hopeful, and I'm glad that I sincerely, through these great folks that I worked with, I sincerely found a very hopeful story to tell. And it's truly a gift, to be able to do this stuff.
I'm probably oversimplifying here, but when I was going through your book, what struck me that I really enjoyed about it was that there's you told the story of this symbiotic relationship, not only between the animals and the plants and, nature that feeds off of the river and depends on the river and all of those things. But you also talk about the humans that occupy the spaces that are surrounding the river and the different occupations that depend on the river for their livelihoods, like river raft guides and rafting companies. And you also talk about the indigenous peoples that depend on the river for kind of their culture and their livelihoods and food and water and things like that. So I just found that approach to be, it's very comprehensive, but also kind of paints a broader story of the river itself, and not just like, hey, this river is important because of wildlife. I think he did a really good job of expanding the vision of what the actual story was to be told.
Thank you. The river guide piece is really interesting because I was on one river trip where I heard one of the guides say, a female guide, she said, "I have way too many degrees to be doing this shit." And I processed that and I thought, that's true. Like, your river guide can be a high school dropout or a PhD. And why is it that wide of a range? It's because the river chooses these people. And so you have to include, that ethos in your story. It's really, really important. And the river, if you spend time on rivers, you get that sense that the river works magic. Rivers heal. And there's a lot of thought and written material about that idea. So I tried to capture that thought through river guides. And the indigenous folks that I worked with in Monument Valley accepted me, welcomed me, told their story so generously, beautifully. And I continue to be engaged with the Wilson family and with Jonah Yellowman, who's an elder in Monument Valley, and also with Utah Denebakea, which is the 5-tribe coalition, now a commission for tribal co-management of public lands. That was a 2-part story. I originally was interested in the traditional foods gardens that are grown in those desert lands. Folks have to haul water because they don't have access to water, so that's a really interesting aspect to it too. And to see just exactly how they use so little water. And then Ann Castle, who's the Upper Colorado River Basin Commissioner, who was appointed by Joe Biden, she, during the pandemic, with her partner, Bitta Becker, who is Navajo Dene, they created the I'll just say tribalwater.org, Universal Rights to Clean Water for Tribal Communities. They created that initiative, got funding for Water for Tribes. The water hasn't reached our friends in Monument Valley yet. There's a whole legal process to go through, but it's happening, and there's just an extreme need. So that ended up being a 2-part story. But yeah, I endeavored to tell this whole thing through people who are doing great work.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the ways that I stay kind of connected to the story of the Colorado River, there's a really great writer. He has a blog that he manages called The Land Desk. I don't know if you're familiar with his
Yes.
blog. I think his name is Jonathan Thompson. Is that right? Jonathan Thompson. And I just really love the stories he tells, and he kind of gives you a lot of the kind of legislative battles that are occurring, and he kind of gives you context. He asks questions like, I bet you thought that the native individuals have first rights to the water. Not true. In fact, a lot of them have no rights to the water, which is really fascinating. So I'd be curious to hear you talk more about how you worked with the indigenous people, especially in Monument Valley and Bears Ears, and what the situation with the indigenous waters and tribal co-management of public lands looks like.
Yeah, so in 2019, I went to the Utah Denebekea summer gathering in Bears Ears, and it's up kind of at the 8,000 foot level near the actual Bears Ears buttes in beautiful ponderosa pine and meadow landscape that is so wildly different than, for instance, the canyons of Cedar Mesa or the goosenecks by the San Juan. And I met so many wonderful people, and they have these gatherings where it's just free, open to everybody, and it's just this welcoming, generous gathering, and that left a huge impression on me. And I met some folks and continued the conversation. And like I said a moment ago, I was looking for a good indigenous story, because I don't think you have a story about the Colorado River unless you have the original peoples who are still here. They didn't somehow die out when the ancestral Puebloans died out. They're still here. So that was the start of it. And I just, pathways from there led me to Cynthia Wilson, who at the time was the traditional foods coordinator for Utah Denebekea. So she was helping other families with their traditional foods gardens, growing corn, beans, squash, and the Bears Ears potatoes. Interestingly, the original boundaries that were drawn for the proposed Bears Ears National Monument were drawn by mapping the vegetation plots of the ancestral Puebloans. By the way, we don't say Anasazi anymore. That's a very offensive term to indigenous people. So we say ancient ones or ancestral Puebloans.
My understanding about that is that it was kind of like a derogatory term that the Navajo used.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I don't need to know anymore. It's like, if you guys are offended, I'm not doing it. So
yeah, exactly.
And it's just important that we educate ourselves that these are sacred sites. For instance, we don't say ruin. We might say dwelling instead. These are, if we think in terms of a church or some spectacular place in nature that's sacred to us, that's a good way to look at it. Anyway, that's where all of that began. And then I hooked up with Ann Castle on the she started telling me about the extreme need for access to water, and I was able to witness that firsthand and go to the Goulding's collection station with Henry Wilson and see that it takes 2.5 hours to fill your 325-gallon water tank in your dedicated 3/4-ton water truck, just to gather the water, 2.5 hours. Then you have to take it home and distribute it to tanks. And so there's a lot of challenges, but these are incredible people and happy, joyful, generous, kind, welcoming folks. And it's been one of the most gratifying parts of this journey to work with the good folks in the Monument Valley region.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the, you were asking about my Colorado Trail experience, and one of the takeaways that I had from that journey is no matter what you're doing in photography, I've found that it's the personal connections that we make with other people and communities that really is what a lot of this is about for me. It's the connections and the human stories that we get to tell, and the connection piece with other human beings. Like, that part is so important for us. We're social animals, and I think the more we can lean into that in our photography, the better.
Absolutely. And you spoke of connective tissue a bit ago. Love is the connective tissue that holds us all together. So what if we go about our business and we're just kind and open and let these opportunities unfold for us? And frankly, if you're working with other folks and you gain access and you have, and I'm not just speaking of indigenous people, but in general, if you take this approach, you're going to find really interesting, different photographic and story opportunities that are oftentimes quite unexpected.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of the photography side of the project, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about kind of what your approach was in terms of composing different scenes. I mean, you have a very wide variety of wildlife, portraiture, traditional landscape, some more abstract type stuff. It's pretty much runs the gamut of what you would consider a generalist, So I'm curious kind of what your approach has been more on the technical side of the photography piece of the project.
Sure. And thank you. I think of it like a funnel in the beginning. The story is a funnel. And so you've got this just wide opening, and you can just go make any pictures you want. You're just working with a really big idea, and you haven't drilled down to a granular level yet. And then you start to identify, some important ideas, and maybe you focus a little more on a single bird or a single idea, and it gets narrower and narrower. And as the story starts to really take shape, then that opening gets tiny. And that's that point where the story decides what pictures you need to make. But big picture, I know that every place needs a big landscape or more that's emblematic of that place. And who lives there and what are their needs, these animal needs. For in the Headwaters chapter, I tried to make a relationship of white-tailed ptarmigan, pika, marmot, and people to snowpack. And so once you have that idea, then you start working with, okay, what pictures do I need to make to tie all of these seemingly different individuals to snowpack? And so that's one approach. Much of it is place-driven. A lot of it is gaining knowledge from locals and pulling on threads that say, okay, I need to maybe take a left turn and do some night photography in the Gila River watershed because this place the floodplain really comes to life at night, and maybe I need to make those pictures for a while. So, again, the story decides ultimately. If we just get out of our own way, the pictures will find us.
I love that. Yeah, I mean,
but did you find that on the Colorado Trail or in some of your exploits, or you're a mountain climber, you go climb a 14er and you think you know what to expect, but we do it because we're curious too, right?
It's a good question because I think it depends on where you are at in your journey as a photographer. I would say that I probably wouldn't have even been open to the approach that you're describing until maybe 6 or 7 years into my journey as a photographer, where I kind of shifted towards what we were describing earlier, removing expectations and having preconceived ideas of what I wanted to photograph, and then just letting the landscape kind of speak to me and leaning into my personal interests, leaning into the types of subjects that spoke to me. There's going to be things that speak to you that I'm like, it's okay. But then there's going to be things that speak to me and I'm like, oh my God, that's the best thing I've ever seen. And you'd be like, it's okay. So I think it's really important to kind of know thyself, right? And it takes some time, right? You start to get a better understanding of your preferences, the subjects that you're more interested in, the ones that you're not. And it's okay. Everyone doesn't have to like everything. But I think once you reach that point in your photography, then you can go on a journey like you're describing, or you can do the Colorado Trail as a photographer and come away with photographs that are more personal and perhaps more meaningful and representative of kind of you as the translator of the experience as a photographer.
That's awesome.
That was kind of a mouthful.
That was really good. Hopefully somebody's recording this.
That's funny. No, it's funny because you said that and I was like, you're talking about, oh, sure, you go climb a 14er and you know what you're going to do, right? And I'm like, man, 2012, nope. I'd get to the top. I would do a 300. I would take a picture like that, which is from 2011. It's a big panoramic at sunrise, which I still love. I mean, I would love to have a photo like that from every mountain, but there's so much more, right? Yeah. Anyway, I don't think it's as easy as we're making it sound.
No, nothing's easy. That's the allure.
That's true. That is one of the things that I absolutely love about photography. But I do think, at least for me, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your response to this. But for me, there was kind of this point where it was like, am I going to get over this ridge, or am I just going to quit and just give it up? Because I'm just not finding myself, my voice, my vision. And I think a lot of people reach that point in their photography and they give up. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, totally. There are so many points of extreme frustration and rejection, and why isn't anyone seeing the value in this idea, that sort of thing. It's hard to get funded for conservation work, especially when it's over a period of years, so you end up doing a lot of grinding. It's the reason that I pretty much don't sleep in hotels. I just sleep in my truck and save money and sort of operate as a fancy dirt bag out there roaming the West. But yeah, it's frustrating. It's hard, and oftentimes elements don't come together the way we think they will, and then we have to adjust and on the fly, and then oftentimes that leads to a better picture anyway. Or
right.
All these hard lessons happen for whatever reason, and you just don't have that perspective till you get way down the road.
Yeah, and the thing I keep coming back to is try not to think about it too hard, right? Like, you're going to have good days and bad days. You're going to have photographs that are better than others. It's a very long road. It's a marathon.
Absolutely is. And I think you absolutely have to have that perspective. Certainly, if I divided my time as a full-time photographer into sort of 5-year segments, you can see a progression. You can see just how much your perspective changes over time, and that those things that were big deals back then are really tiny little speed bumps, but they seemed like that rejection seemed like a big deal at the time, maybe. So yeah, you have to have that perspective of it's a journey, it's a continuum. When crummy things happen, they're not happening to you. It's just part of it, and you just keep going, and that's the deal. And what else are we going to do at this point?
Exactly.
I can't do anything else.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I wanted to ask you a few more questions about the project for the book, and we can go in one of two directions or maybe both directions. On one hand, you kind of have, like you were talking about before, like the story. If you let go, the story kind of tells you what you need to photograph, right?
Yeah.
But I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how you organize your thoughts. Like, as you're going along in the journey, you have this idea for the project, for the book, but you haven't completely fleshed it out because, as you said, the ideas start to come to you as you're working on the project. And I'm kind of coming at this from more of like a technical and logistical perspective, like practicality. Like, did you have like a giant spreadsheet, or did you have like a flow chart or a Gantt chart, or like how did you organize the ideas that eventually led to what coalesced into the book itself?
Wonderful question. How much time do we have?
I know.
So I don't keep a giant spreadsheet, and I do keep a journal, and I sketch out ideas in my journal, and it just gets mashed up with field notes and other thoughts, but it gives me a reference point to go from. And when I'm thinking about, like in the context of the Living River book, I'm thinking about doing a story on the Gila, for instance. So I look at the Gila River. Okay, that's the only free-flowing Southwest river. It's pretty much the last wild river. So that's a beginning point. And then you start to think about relationships. So every place I go into, I think about all of these different relationships, and that it pays to be curious in that sense. So the Gila has no dam. It flows freely. It floods. That means it creates willow and cottonwood. And so now it's emblematic of what a wild Southwest river could be. Conversely, the San Pedro has been, which is just a couple hours to the west, the groundwater's been overpumped for 40 years, and so most of the river is dry, and they have to infiltrate gray water into the alluvial aquifer to raise the water table. So two very different rivers, and then you just look at it and you go, okay, what's here? And why is it here? And what does it relate to? And what do the birds eat? And how do they move through this landscape? And who are the people? And how are those people organizing to keep this place as good as, or make it as good as it can be? And all of those questions, start to flush out the ideas and the grist for what's the connective tissue for what's going to be that story. And I do think, like if you're doing a big story, a watershed, do need to have places that are emblematic of other places so that, anybody can relate to that wild river, that compromised river, that person who's making a difference. Gives them handles, again, to enter the story.
So as you were talking, you made it sound so simple, like, oh, I know this about the Gila, and because it's not dammed, it's got cottonwoods and willows, and this happens and that happens. And obviously, that's knowledge that you've accumulated, right, over your career as a conservation photographer. It's not like me personally, I wouldn't have known that, right? Like, so how did you accumulate the knowledge that you were able to leverage in terms of helping to tell the story? Maybe to put it in other words, how did you know what to pay attention to, right? Like, this story about the cottonwoods because you had some knowledge about what this river meant in terms of the watershed. So, like, how did you get that information? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I knew initially my story would be mostly a natural history story. And I was also paying close attention to who else was telling stories on the Colorado River, or in watersheds in general, and how they were telling the stories. And as we talked about in the outset, there's a lot of stories about a dying river, and that's dams and reservoirs and agricultural fields. That isn't where I wanted to spend my time. And so then that eliminates a lot of stuff in terms of your main focus. And then you start thinking about, okay, well, what is a wild river? What is the makeup of a wild river? And asking all of those questions and seeking out experts. So I really endeavored to go to the top people who are doing really important work in the Colorado River to understand their perspectives and to understand also what is pragmatic. Stay within the boundaries of science. Don't go off and give a bunch of Dave's opinions about things, and really understand, what the hydrological makeup is of this huge, massive chunk of the American West, and how it all flows together, and how all those pieces fit. And what does it mean when people say everybody lives downstream? It's really important to internalize stuff like that because that can give you a frame of reference in a really small package. So it's just a lot of research and digging in, but more than anything, it's about being present on the river, or in your case, on the mountaintop, on the journey, just being present, being there, soaking it in, having the experiences as witness. And the witnessing really informs, that's the other half. I'd say all the research and all that stuff, the intention to make certain pictures, like you have a map in your head of the pictures you want to make when you drive 1,000 miles to get to a place to make pictures. So it's really important that you do that pre-planning. But the other half of that is to leave a big opening for what you witness, what you experience, and how that fits into what you have to say.
As you were describing that, the three words that came to mind were intense, insatiable curiosity.
Well, but for you, how much of that resonates with your kind of work? It's not that different, right?
No, absolutely, for sure. It's just that for myself, I haven't had that hyper focus in terms of a story like that, and that's something that I definitely thirst for. I want that in my own photography at some point. I still feel like I'm in that phase of honing in on exactly the stories I want to tell first, but I think I've kind of figured out the photography side of things. It's like, okay, now that I've got that, now it's time to do a little bit more self-reflection and those important steps. But the other thing as you were talking is, I led a workshop to Svalbard this year mostly to photograph polar bears, and it was once again like, yeah, I want to photograph some polar bears. But what was really cool is that one of our students, her name's Karen, she was really captivated by this particular polar bear that we got to witness. And it was kind of a sad story, but it was this polar bear came right up to the shore near where our boat was at. And then it started playing with this huge plastic bag. And we're we're at like 80 degrees north. We're way up there and there's a giant plastic bag. And and you're like, where did this plastic bag come from? And to her credit, she like went down the rabbit hole and did all this research, contacted people, tried to understand like how come there's all this plastic waste in Svalbard, and she came to some conclusions and she wrote up a whole story about it. So I thought that was really cool. And that's kind of an example of what you're talking about is you go there with the expectation you're going to see this thing, but then you open yourself up just enough to be able to tell the story of what you actually get to see. So I think that's a great approach.
Yeah, well put, and I envy your trip to Svalbard. I'll give you one quick example of something that was organic. I was in Saguaro National Park, Tucson Mountain Park, at a campground. I travel through there on the way to other places quite a bit and just revel in that place. And so I'm watching Gila woodpeckers. And Gila woodpeckers are feeding nestlings in a saguaro cactus. So and I know that the saguaro desert is, or the wettest desert in the world. And that's because of monsoons. And then saguaros are only in that place because it is the wettest desert in the world. And then there's this mutualistic relationship between Gila woodpeckers and saguaro cacti. And then they create these saguaro condos where every year the Gila woodpeckers dig a new hole a year in advance, and the cactus calcifies and protects its own flesh, and the birds eat the insects that would harm the cactus, and they help each other. And I learned all of that stuff just with a couple little Google taps on my phone, standing in a campground, And so that's the bones of a big story, right? You could blow that up and turn it into whatever you want it to be. And I guess my whole point is be curious, be endlessly curious.
Yeah, and the knowledge is right at our fingertips,
Yep.
as you said, which is really cool.
Yeah.
See, question I have is for people who are listening who have a relationship with the Colorado River or perhaps a river that's close to them, what can we do? Like, what are some actionable steps that other photographers can take?
This is my favorite question because the answer is so simple. Go to the river and be present with her and let the river soak into you. And, for photographers, you'll make some pictures and that's important. But the really important part is for each of us to develop our own relationship to rivers in the American West. And photographers especially have the ability to shift people's perceptions because we're the witnesses. Those other folks aren't witnessing. And it sounds really silly to say, go to the river and be present with her. I love saying her because my indigenous friend taught me that the Colorado is a female river. And the Navajo people are a matrilineal society, so there's a lot of elegance to all of that, and it brings to mind the point that it's really important, the words we use and how we describe places and things. None of us that are on this podcast today that are listening are going to be in those rooms renegotiating the terms of the Colorado River Compact. That's happening between 7 U.S. states and 2 Mexican states. And it's really, really intense. But what we can do is we can speak for our home river. We can speak for that place that really touched us deeply in some meaningful way, and that experience is different than anybody else's experience because it was our own. And I think all of that stuff, and that it goes back to that business of having something to say, all of that stuff really, really matters. You can't go to the headwaters and take a picture that's beautiful and has the Never Summer Range in the background and say Colorado River and Rocky Mountain National Park. There's so much more going on around us, and all of that life is there for the river. If you travel the whole watershed, everything you see has been shaped by the river. There's no separation, and that's what we try to get to with these stories, is to a point where there's no separation between us and these amazing places we get to work in.
And sometimes it takes time to develop that relationship and to hone in on an idea that has substance and merit.
You have places you go back to over and over, right?
Absolutely. For me, obviously the San Juan Mountains, it's a big place, but there's specific little watersheds within there that I'm very fond of. And I'm particularly enamored by some of the locations that I've visited in Southeast Utah, like near Mexican Hat and over in that area, that part of Utah. I'm really in love with that territory, that area. For sure, the Grand Canyon. I just haven't spent enough time there, but it's every time I go, I'm like, this place is amazing. So yeah, of course, there's places that I would love to spend 20 years photographing, and I probably only can do that for maybe 20, 30, 40 more years. So for me, that's the downside, is like I have all these places I love and there's just not enough time.
Find a way to get to all of them. You mentioned the Grand Canyon, so maybe that's Disneyland on the Colorado River, but in a very serious way, that place, the environs of the Grand Canyon are so sacred. And there's nothing like being on the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, to feel all of that purpose of the river to reach the sea, and the roar of the river all night long, 24/7. And the thing about it is, as witnesses, you hear all the stories of how deeply changed people are after they go down the Grand Canyon, particularly on a raft trip. And they're all changed for different reasons. Something touched them so deeply that they carry it with them for the rest of their lives. And that's what this sharing of our work is tapping into that, because those things really, really matter in a deep, visceral human way. And the world needs those stories, frankly. There's a lot of really ugly, gnarly stuff out there. And here we are on a podcast talking about beauty and love of nature and the whole bit. And that's so relatable to everybody. Everybody gravitates to beauty, no matter how you see the world.
What advice would you have for people who want to share those stories, and maybe they don't have the resources or the time to do a book project, and maybe they're frustrated with social media and how it doesn't work for most people? Like, what would you suggest people try to do in order to get some of those stories shared with the rest of the world?
A long time ago, a dear friend said, I was kicking around an idea, and my friend said, just start. Well, Dave, sometimes you just have to start. So that's part one. I'm a huge fan of The Creative Act, a book by Rick Rubin about the creative process, why we create. Rick, in a very elegant way, talks about the idea of we don't create with outcomes in mind. We just create because that's what we need to do for our souls, for ourselves. And I think, that's everybody on this podcast that's listening is out there creating some meaningful work. And then the question becomes, what am I going to do with this? And how am I connected to this work? How does it connect to other people? And I think, once we have an idea, we owe it to ourselves to chase that idea down a little bit and to do some thinking about it and go out and make pictures that relate to that idea. And then to reconsider, is this something I'm interested in doing? My first project, I didn't know anything. I was calling it Denver Wild. I was just photographing wild spaces right on the fringes of the city. Sketchy prairie, that kind of stuff. Bike paths, a creek running along a bike path where there's maybe screech owls or something. I was doing that kind of stuff. And that became, I didn't know it at the time, but that would become Prairie Thunder, my book about the eastern half of Colorado, the shortgrass prairie. So that started with the tiniest idea of just going and poking around. And you know what? When I want to go have fun, I go back to those same places. And I just walk around with a camera and shoot for my soul. So each of us can come at it from a different way, but sometimes you just have to start.
That's beautiful. Dave, what are you working on now?
I'm about to start another book tour. I think I did 40 presentations last year.
That's awesome.
around the West, and I'll be mostly in the Southwest this fall. I'm going to shoot an assignment in Rocky Mountain National Park this week, a short assignment. I have numerous spin-off story ideas from the Living River book. I have a camera in a tree on the Mexican border, 2 miles north of the border on the San Pedro River, with a rain sensor on the box. It's a time-lapse camera documenting the monsoons down there. And when I was last there at the end of July, I experienced 2 incredible monsoon events, and I can't wait to get back and see what's on that camera, on that memory card. There's some songbird work, a wide variety of things. And I'm pitching an indigenous story idea today. So.
Wow. Well, congratulations, and that's amazing. And I can't wait to see the time-lapse footage. That sounds so cool. I've always been fascinated with the idea of using, remote cameras and camera traps and things like that. And it's something that I haven't dug quite deeply enough into, but it sounds like it's fairly accessible because I hear a lot of people getting more and more into that.
Just have to be willing to accept a high rate of failure, but the reward, the payoff is pretty huge. I started camera trapping really close to home out of necessity during the pandemic in a little creek just west of Arvada. In a couple of days, I had recorded mountain lions and bobcats and black bears and a bunch of other stuff. It's mind-blowing. So, the animals take over the night, and we have to expand our imaginations to include that cycle of life, and it's pretty fabulous.
Do you have any resources that you would recommend for people who are interested in dabbling in that?
Oh, all of my knowledge of camera trapping came from friends who are doing it, and I lean hard on Michael Forsberg, who's been 35 years doing this kind of work. So grateful for Mike and all his tutorship and ideas. But all of us, I think, that are camera trapping ILCP friends, we exchange ideas. And, I've done some YouTube searches and seen what other folks are doing, and that helped inform my approach. So you just have to start.
Nothing like a little YouTube university. It's like trying to fix something on your car, right? Like, I'll just see what happens, see what I can find.
One day through YouTube, I will be a better Lightroom user.
Well, that's a whole other thing, man. So I had one more question for you related to the book project, and take your time in thinking about how to answer this one. But now that the project is in the rearview mirror, I'm curious, what was kind of your biggest takeaway, either for yourself or for the river itself, that maybe surprised you?
I would say in terms of finishing the book, that's in the rear view, but the project is very much part of my life every day still. Biggest surprise, extraordinarily vibrant and dynamic the river can be when we just give her a nudge, when we replant willow, and we encourage life. And the river is life. The river carries life in flow. Anywhere the river flows, there is life, abundant, dynamic life. And just the notion that I think we view a lot of nature through the lens of the pristine, or maybe what it was 200 years ago, and that's not fair. I think we have to look at places, because humans are everywhere, we have to look at places for their potential. And the idea that of what this place could be with just a little bit of love. And what is a functioning ecosystem? I think that's a lot more important question than what is pristine, because we can't get there. It's unattainable. But we can still get to spectacular. And so I'm most taken aback by the idea that if you just have those three elements that we talked about at the beginning, flowing water, cottonwood, and willow, you have an explosion of life in arid landscapes that all has to go to the river. And that's a good place to begin a hopeful story.
I love it. What a gift you've given us today, Dave. All right, 3 books under your belt now. How long do these projects take from start to finish? What's a realistic timeline look like?
Yeah, even though I said earlier you can't consider outcomes in the beginning when you start a project, once you make that decision that I want this thing to be a book, or I want it to be a movie, or whatever thing you plan to create with this body of work, then you start to lock into, okay, where do I need to be, what seasons, and then you begin to calculate a time frame. I spent 4 years on my prairie book. That was just my first entry point in learning to tell a decent story. I spent 6 years on my sage spirit book, and I spent, now I'm in my 8th or 9th year with the Colorado River, but it was parts of 6 years to make the pictures. 7th year was putting the book together and writing it. So it takes some time. My buddy Mike just finished his whooping crane book, it took him 6 years. So 4 to 6 years for a book is probably a good time frame. But you might decide, hey, I want to do a short video. I want to do a 3-minute piece on my big walk on the Colorado Trail, and you shot clips along the way, and there was some strategic decisions made on what might be important, and you could create something really meaningful in a relatively short amount of time in that sense. So it just depends on what you want to do with the stuff. But I think the other part of this is we owe it to ourselves to think bigger than our original idea. So while a lot of places can be references for other places, I think there is the notion that we can just expand that idea and make it grander. Because we have the potential to make more and deeper connections if we just be more open to what might come to us. So the beginning idea might not look anything like the finished product.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to let it take you where it wants to go.
Exactly.
Love it.
We could have done this whole interview by just having you say that.
That's awesome. All right, last question, Dave. Who do you recommend for the podcast?
I've got some names for you. I've got 4 here.
4 is perfect.
Michael Forsberg just finished a 6-year whooping crane book that traversed the whole North American continent pretty much. And he is a co-founder of Platte Basin Time Lapse. Amy Gulick in the Northwest tells stories of salmon and salmon people, and is also a Braided River photographer and author. Alan Mirabiyashi is a co-founder of Photo Shelter, and I saw him do a presentation on I Love Photography, and it still like blows my mind to think what he did with that presentation. The guy is a super interesting character who understands where photography is headed and trends, and he's got his finger on the pulse of all that stuff. And the last one is Clay Bolt, dear friend in Montana, who is a wild bee specialist and world-renowned and they're all world-class human beings. So those are my people.
I love that. And I've got good news for listeners who maybe are new to the show. We had Clay Bolt probably 4 years ago now, and one of my favorite episodes. We talked a lot about his project where he basically saved a bee species, which is super cool. And then Amy Gulick's also been on, and she talked about her Salmon in the Trees project. So those are awesome recommendations, and people can check out the archives if they are interested in those 2 photographers. So Dave, awesome. This has been so much fun. If you're down for it, I would love to do a bonus episode after this, talking more specifics on the Colorado River Compact renegotiations, if you're up for that.
Let's do it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again. And if everyone's interested, tune in to the Patreon bonus. All right. Well, thank you to Dave for providing us with so much inspiration today. Your perspective and wisdom is honestly a bit intoxicating. Thank you. If you find value in these conversations, please do consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. At $10 per month, you can gain access to episodes up to 2 months early and also gain access to over 230 bonus episodes. Each week, we release new episodes on Patreon, and in the show notes, there are questions for you to respond to. Joining is free, but I appreciate you contributing some financial amount on Patreon if you can. Thank you to each and every one of you who already has. You're the best. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.